welcome back to Nighttime History. Today we will be journeying into the workshop of a medieval candlemaker, following the patient rhythms of tallow and beeswax, the endless dipping and cooling, the quiet craft that brought light to monasteries and manor houses across the medieval world. Thank you for joining us tonight. Sit back and relax as we dive deep into this slowest of workshops, where time itself seemed to pool and thicken like melted wax, where the day's work was measured not in hours but in layers, in the gradual building of something essential from almost nothing at all. The workshop stands on a narrow lane in a prosperous town somewhere in 14th century England, though it could just as easily be Bruges or Florence or Cologne, for the candlemaker's craft varied little across Christendom. The building itself announces its purpose before you even step inside. A faint sweetness hangs in the air, detectable from several houses away, the particular smell of rendered animal fat mixed with something warmer, almost honeyed when the chandler has been working with beeswax. This scent clings to the stones of the street, to the wooden frames of the windows, to the clothing of everyone who works within these walls. It is not unpleasant, this smell, merely persistent, a molecular memory of 1,000 candles that have passed through this space. The chandlers, as candlemakers were properly known, occupied a particular station in the medieval economy. They were not among the most prestigious craftsmen, not like the goldsmiths or the furriers who worked with costly materials, but neither were they common labourers. Their guild, in towns large enough to support one, held respectable if not exalted status. A master chandler in a good location could maintain a comfortable household, perhaps employ 2 or 3 journeymen, take on an apprentice or 2. The work required skill, certainly, but also capital, for the raw materials were expensive and the production process required significant space and equipment. Imagine standing at the threshold of this workshop in the deep blue hour before dawn. The master chandler and his senior journeyman would already be moving about inside, their shapes visible through the dim glow of a single rushlight. The medieval workday began early, dictated by the cost of artificial light and the patterns of the natural world. In summer, work might begin as early as 4 in the morning. In winter, perhaps closer to 6, though the candlemaker's schedule was more flexible than most, since he of all craftsmen had the means to work into the darkness. The workshop itself was a carefully organised space, every element positioned according to decades of practice. The room was larger than you might expect, needing to accommodate not just the work itself, but the long drying racks where hundreds of candles would hang at various stages of completion. The ceiling stood high, perhaps 12 or 13 feet, with heavy beams blackened by years of smoke and vapours. Along one wall, a large hearth, broader and deeper than a cooking fire, designed to hold the great rendering pots and melting vessels that were the heart of the operation. The chandler's raw materials arrived in forms that bore little resemblance to the finished product. Tallow, the rendered fat of cattle or sheep, came in hard, yellowish blocks or sometimes in barrels as a semi-solid mass. This was not the clean, processed substance we might imagine, but something that still carried traces of blood, membrane, and the particular smell of the slaughterhouse. Beeswax arrived in large, irregular chunks, or sometimes in slabs, darker than the pale yellow we associate with beeswax today, often containing bits of honeycomb, propolis, dead bees, and various other hive debris. The first work of the day, before any candles could be made, involved preparation. The chandlers knew that the quality of their product depended entirely on the purity of their materials. Raw tallow required careful rendering, a process that separated the fat from any remaining tissue, blood, or impurities. This work often took place in a separate room or even a separate building when possible, for the smell of rendering tallow was powerful and unmistakable. The scent of hot animal fat mixed with the faint metallic tang of blood and the earthy odour of whatever the animals had last eaten. Picture this process unfolding in the pre-dawn quiet. A journeyman would cut chunks of raw tallow into smaller pieces, exposing more surface area to the heat. These pieces went into a large iron pot, perhaps holding 20 or 30 pounds of fat. The pot sat over a carefully managed fire, hot enough to melt the fat, but not so hot as to burn it, for burned tallow produced candles that smoked terribly and smelled worse. The fat melted slowly, liquefying into a cloudy, off-white substance that required constant attention. The chandler, or his assistant, would skim the surface repeatedly, removing the bits of meat, membrane, and other debris that floated to the top. This skimming required patience and a good eye, the ability to distinguish between harmless air bubbles and actual impurities. The removed waste went into a separate container. Nothing was discarded in a medieval workshop, for even these scraps had value. Soap makers would buy them, or they might be fed to pigs or rendered again at lower temperatures for the cheapest grades of rush dips. Meanwhile, another worker prepared the wicks. This task was more complex than it might appear. The best wicks were made from cotton when it could be obtained, though this was expensive and usually reserved for beeswax candles destined for wealthy customers. More commonly, wicks were made from loosely spun hemp, flax, or even rushes for the cheapest candles. The key was the spinning. The wick needed to be loose enough to draw up melted wax or tallow through capillary action, but tight enough to burn steadily without excessive guttering or smoking. The wick makers, often young apprentices or the chandler's own children, would sit by the window where the growing light allowed fine work. They twisted fibres between their palms or used a simple spindle, creating lengths of wick that were then cut to size. For dipped candles, these wicks needed to be long enough to handle comfortably, perhaps 18 inches to 2 feet. Each wick was looped over a thin wooden rod called a brooch, with the loop at the centre and the two ends hanging down. A single brooch might hold 6 to 12 wicks, depending on their spacing, and a productive day's work might involve hundreds of brooches. The rhythm of candle dipping was perhaps the most meditative aspect of the entire craft. Imagine watching this process as the morning light strengthens. The tallow or wax has been prepared, strained, and brought to the proper temperature in wide, deep kettles. These vessels were often made of copper or iron, designed to retain heat and deep enough to accommodate the full length of the candles being made. The chandler tested the temperature with practiced fingers, knowing that the wax needed to be fully liquid but not steaming hot, warm enough to coat smoothly but cool enough to begin setting almost immediately. The master chandler and his journeymen worked at a steady, unhurried pace. One worker took a brooch heavy with its burden of wicks and dipped it smoothly into the kettle, submerging the wicks completely, then lifting it out with an even motion. The wicks emerged coated with a thin layer of tallow or wax, barely thicker than they went in. This was placed on a rack to cool while the next brooch was dipped, and the next and the next. By the time a dozen or 15 brooches had been dipped, the first was cool enough to dip again. This was the essential patience of the craft. Each dip added perhaps a 1/16 of an inch to the candle's diameter, sometimes less. A finished candle of reasonable thickness might require 20, 30, even 40 dips, depending on the desired size and the temperature of the wax. The The chandlers developed a rhythm, moving between kettles, checking temperatures, adjusting the fire, examining previous dips for any irregularities. Their hands moved with unconscious precision, knowing exactly how long to submerge, how quickly to withdraw, how to give a slight twist at the bottom to prevent drips from forming. You could stand here and watch for an hour and see barely perceptible change. The wicks gradually thickened, taking on the pale yellow-white of tallow or the warmer gold of beeswax. The workshop filled with the soft sounds of the work, the slight splash as broaches entered the kettles, the whisper of wooden rods being moved on racks, the occasional crackle from the hearth. The chandlers might talk quietly among themselves, discussing orders or the quality of the latest shipment of tallow, but often they worked in comfortable silence, each man lost in the rhythm of his task. The medieval chandler understood something about his materials that we have largely forgotten. Tallow and beeswax behaved differently, required different techniques, produced different products. Tallow candles, made from beef or mutton fat, were the workhorses of medieval lighting. They were affordable enough for moderately prosperous households, churches, and civic buildings. But tallow had its drawbacks. It produced more smoke than beeswax, a greasy black smoke that left residue on walls and ceilings. It smelled distinctly of animal fat when burning, not entirely unpleasant but unmistakable. And tallow candles were softer, more prone to bending in warm weather, more likely to gutter and drip. Beeswax, by contrast, was the aristocrat of candle materials. It burned with a clear, bright flame and a sweet, faint honey scent. It produced almost no smoke when properly made. Beeswax candles could be stored for years without degrading, but beeswax cost perhaps 10 to 20 times as much as tallow, sometimes more, and its supply was limited by the number of beehives and the skill of beekeepers. The chandlers reserved beeswax for special commissions, for churches that could afford the expense, for wealthy households that valued the cleaner burn. Some chandlers specialized exclusively in one material or the other, but most maintained the capability to work with both. The techniques differed slightly. Beeswax needed to be heated more carefully, as it could scorch more easily than tallow. It also needed more thorough filtering, as any impurities would be visible in the translucent finished candle. But beeswax also held fragrance better, and some chandlers would add small amounts of aromatic materials, perhaps a touch of rose oil or lavender for the wealthiest customers, though this was rare in specialized work. As the morning progressed, the workshop settled into its full routine. The dipping continued in steady waves, but other tasks proceeded simultaneously. One worker might be preparing a new batch of tallow, rendering and filtering, while his colleagues continued dipping. Another might be trimming finished candles, using a sharp knife to remove any irregularities at the base or tip, creating a smooth, professional appearance. The trimmings, like everything else, were saved, melted down again for the next batch. The chandlers also produce candles by other methods when required. Molded candles, formed by pouring melted wax or tallow into metal or ceramic molds, were faster to produce and could achieve more uniform shapes. But molding required significant capital investment in the molds themselves, and many chandlers found that their customers actually preferred the slight irregularities of hand-dipped candles, perceiving them as marks of careful craftsmanship. Some monasteries and churches specifically requested dipped candles for this reason, believing that the meditative labour involved in their creation made them more appropriate for religious use. Imagine the workshop at midday. The light from the high windows falls in dusty beams through air hazed with vapour from the kettles. Hundreds of candles hang at various stages of completion, creating a strange forest of pale cylinders. The chandlers pause for a simple meal, perhaps bread and cheese and small beer, eaten standing or perched on stools, for there was no formal break in the medieval workday as we would understand it. They ate when hunger and the rhythm of work allowed, then returned to their tasks. The afternoon brought different work. Some of the morning's candles had reached completion, thick enough for their purpose, cool and hardened. These needed to be removed from their brooches, a simple task, but one requiring care, for a careless hand could mar the surface. The chandlers cut the wicks at the loop, separating each pair of candles. The wicks were trimmed to appropriate length, perhaps half an inch protruding from the top. Each candle was examined for flaws. Slight bends were corrected by gentle warming and straightening. Any serious defects meant the candle was returned to the melting pot. Now came the counting and bundling. The chandlers sold their products by the dozen or the score, and accurate counting was essential both for honest business and for the regulations of their guild. Candles of similar size and quality were grouped together. The chandler might maintain several grades. The finest beeswax for churches and nobility, good quality tallow for prosperous merchants and guild halls, cheaper tallow for taverns and workshops, and the most basic rush dips for common households. The bundling required cord or strips of linen, wrapped around groups of candles at several points to hold them secure without marking the wax. The chandler's wife or daughters often performed this task, their smaller hands suited to the careful wrapping. As each bundle was completed, it was recorded in the shop's accounts, simple tally marks or more sophisticated written records depending on the chandler's literacy and the complexity of his business. Let us pause here, at this 2/3 point in our day, to consider the community that surrounds this workshop. The medieval candlemaker did not work in isolation, but as part of an intricate web of supply, demand, and regulation. If you are enjoying this journey into the patient rhythms of medieval craft, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications so you never miss our nighttime travels through history. A like on this video helps us continue creating this content, and we would love to hear from you in the comments. Let us know where you are settling in to sleep tonight, what time it is in your corner of the world, as you drift off to the sounds of medieval industry. The chandler's suppliers formed an essential network. Tallow came from butchers, a constant supply in any town of size. For every slaughtered animal yielded fat. The relationship between chandler and butcher was often formalized through long-standing agreements. A chandler might contract to buy all the tallow from particular butchers, guaranteeing supply and often paying in advance during lean times. The butchers, in turn, relied on chandlers to take this byproduct off their hands, for rendered fat kept poorly and attracted vermin if stored too long. Beeswax came from beekeepers and from monasteries, many of which maintained extensive apiaries. The great Cistercian houses were particularly known for their honey and wax production. A chandler requiring substantial quantities of beeswax might travel to rural monasteries to negotiate purchases directly, or work through middlemen who assembled wax from numerous small producers. The price fluctuated with the season and the success of the bee colonies, rising sharply in poor years when swarms failed or disease struck the hives. The customers for candles were equally varied. Churches represented the largest and most consistent market. Every parish church required candles for the altar, additional candles for feast days, special large candles for particular ceremonies. The great cathedrals and abbey churches consumed truly staggering quantities. Records from 14th century York Minster show purchases of hundreds of pounds of wax annually, all of which had to be formed into candles of various sizes and purposes. The chandlers who supplied such institutions often worked under long-term contracts, delivering specified quantities on regular schedules. Wealthy households purchased candles in significant quantities as well, though their consumption was more variable. A prosperous merchant's house might burn through several pounds of candles each winter month, using them for dining, for work after dark, for illuminating entertaining spaces when guests visited. Noble households consumed even more, as darkness represented a particular challenge to the maintenance of status and dignity. A lord could not allow his hall to fall into darkness during an important feast. Darkness implied poverty or parsimony. The town government itself was a customer. Civic buildings needed illumination, night watchmen required lanterns, public celebrations called for elaborate candle displays. Guild halls purchased candles for their meetings and ceremonies. Taverns and inns bought cheaper grades in large quantities, burning them from dusk until the last customer departed. Even modest households might purchase a few candles for special occasions, though they relied primarily on cheaper rushlights for everyday illumination. The regulation of the candle trade reveals much about medieval urban life and the persistent tension between quality control and profit. The chandlers' guilds, where they existed, enforced standards for materials and methods. Candles were supposed to contain only pure tallow or wax, no adulterants, no mixture of inferior materials to stretch expensive wax. The guilds appointed inspectors to examine shops and finished products, and the penalties for fraud could be severe, ranging from fines to confiscation of goods to expulsion from the guild. Yet the temptation to adulterate was constant. A chandler might mix cheaper tallow into beeswax candles, counting on the customer's inability to detect the substitution until the candle was burned. Or water might be worked into tallow to increase its weight, a fraud that became apparent only when the candle sputtered and smoked excessively. The town records preserve numerous complaints and court cases. In 1327, a London chandler was convicted of selling candles made from tallow mixed with waste fat and old grease. His entire stock was burned publicly, and he was forbidden from practicing his trade for a year. The workshop itself was subject to regulation for reasons of fire safety. Candle making involved large quantities of hot, flammable materials in enclosed spaces heated by open flames. Town ordinances typically required chandlers to maintain leather buckets filled with water, to keep their floors swept clean of wax drippings, to ensure their chimneys were regularly cleaned. Despite these precautions, fires occurred with distressing regularity. A kettle of tallow overturned onto coals could create a conflagration that spread through an entire street before it could be contained. Back in our workshop, the afternoon wears on toward evening. The chandlers have been at their work for perhaps 12 or 13 hours now, with only brief pauses for meals. Yet the pace has never quickened, never become hurried or frantic. This is not work that rewards haste. Rushing leads to uneven dips, to candles that bend or drip, to wasted materials and inferior products. The chandlers have learned the wisdom of steady, patient labour, allowing each layer to cool properly, maintaining consistent temperatures, checking and rechecking their work. As the natural light begins to fail, a curious inversion occurs. The chandler, of all craftsmen, need not cease work with the sunset. He has the means to illuminate his own workspace, and on some evenings, particularly when large orders press, the work might continue by candlelight. Yet most chandlers chose to end their workday with the rest of the town. Candles were valuable, and burning his own product meant reducing his profit. Moreover, the work required good light to maintain quality, and even multiple candles could not match daylight for examining the smoothness of a surface or the purity of melted wax. The end of the workday brought its own tasks. The kettles needed to be cleaned while the wax or tallow was still warm enough to wipe away easily. Any remaining melted material was poured into storage containers, for it would keep well if protected from vermin and moisture. The fires were banked but not extinguished entirely, for the chandler would need heat again in the morning, and restarting a fire from scratch consumed time and expensive materials like tinderbox tinder. The finished candles from the day's work were transferred to storage. This required a cool, dry space, for candles softened in heat and absorbed moisture from damp air. Many chandlers maintained cellars or ground floor storage rooms with stone walls and packed earth floors. The candles were laid on shelves or hung from racks, organized by type and date of manufacture. A well-established chandler might have thousands of candles in storage at any given time, representing significant capital tied up in inventory. The accounting for the day needed to be completed. The master chandler, if he possessed even basic literacy, would record the day's production in a ledger or account book. More commonly, he maintained a tally stick or a board marked with notches and symbols, a system perfectly adequate for tracking production and sales. He noted how many pounds of tallow or wax had been used, how many candles of each type had been completed, what remained in various stages of production. This information was essential for managing the business, for knowing when to purchase more materials, for calculating profit and loss. The medieval chandler's life was not one of drama or adventure. No chandler appears as a hero in the romances and chronicles. Their work generated no exciting stories, involved no dangerous journeys or confrontations with authority. Yet this very ordinariness was the foundation of medieval urban life. Without the patient labour of the chandler, churches could not hold services after dark. Merchants could not audit their accounts by winter candlelight. Scholars could not read and copy manuscripts through the long evenings. Noble households could not maintain the illuminated dignity expected of their station. Consider the total production of a skilled chandler over a working life. A master in a prosperous shop might produce 50,000 candles in a good year, possibly more. Over a career of 30 or 40 years, that could mean more than 1 million candles passing through his hands. Each one requiring multiple dips, each layer calling for judgment about temperature and timing, each finished product reflecting his skill and care. This was the meaning of craft in the medieval world, the accumulation of small acts of skill into something approaching mastery, the transformation of humble materials into essential goods through patient labour. The economics of the candle trade were more complex than they might appear. The chandler's profit margin was modest on common tallow candles, perhaps 10 to 15% after accounting for materials, labour, overhead, and guild fees. The real profit came from beeswax and from value-added work. A chandler who could secure commissions for elaborate church candles, who could produce specialised sizes or colours, who could maintain relationships with wealthy, steady customers, such a chandler could prosper significantly. The most successful might own their workshops outright, perhaps own rental properties as well, achieve the status of substantial citizens eligible for town office. But the risks were equally real. A fire could destroy not just the workshop, but a lifetime's accumulated capital. A bad batch of tallow, contaminated with something that made the candles smoke terribly or smell foul, could ruin a reputation built over decades. Changes in the economy affected demand. War disrupted trade in beeswax. Outbreaks of cattle plague raised tallow prices. The chandler navigated these uncertainties through caution, through maintaining diverse income streams, through the web of relationships with suppliers and customers that provided some stability in an uncertain world. The apprenticeship system ensured the continuation of the craft. A boy might begin his apprenticeship at 12 or 13, bound for 7 years to learn every aspect of the trade. The early years involved menial tasks: sweeping, carrying, maintaining fires, preparing materials. But gradually the apprentice learned the critical skills: how to judge temperature by touch and sight, how to maintain the rhythm of dipping, how to recognize quality in raw materials. A good master taught not just techniques but judgment, the accumulated wisdom of years of practice. The relationship between master and apprentice was intimate and often difficult. The apprentice lived in the master's household, ate at his table, was subject to his discipline. The master was responsible not just for teaching the craft, but for the apprentice's moral development, his integration into Christian society. In return, the apprentice provided increasingly skilled labour at minimal cost. The successful completion of an apprenticeship transformed a boy into a journeyman, qualified to work for wages in any chandler's shop, though he might work for his former master for years more before accumulating the capital to establish his own workshop. Women participated in the candle trade in complex ways. A master's wife often managed the household side of the business, which in a workshop was inseparable from the productive side. She might keep accounts, manage apprentices, handle sales to household customers. Widows of master chandlers sometimes continued operating their late husband's business, recognized by guilds as having sufficient knowledge through years of proximity to the work. Daughters might learn the craft as thoroughly as sons, though they faced greater obstacles to independent practice. Women appeared in the records as candlemakers in their own right, though less frequently than men. The seasonal rhythm of the trade followed patterns dictated by both supply and demand. Autumn was the busiest season for tallow chandlers. The traditional time for slaughtering livestock fell in late autumn, after animals had fattened on summer pasture, but before winter feeding became necessary. Tallow arrived in the greatest quantities and at the lowest prices. Chandlers worked extended hours, processing materials and building inventory for the winter months when demand peaked. A prudent chandler might produce half his annual output in the months from October through January. Beeswax followed a different calendar. Beekeepers harvested honeycomb in late summer and early autumn, when hives were fullest. The wax required processing, boiling in water to separate it from honey residue, straining, forming into blocks. By late autumn, processed beeswax reached the chandlers, who then faced pressure to produce church candles for the great winter feast days. Christmas, Candlemas, Easter, each brought demand for substantial quantities of church candles, and the chandlers worked to meet these predictable but demanding deadlines. The candles themselves carried symbolic weight beyond their practical function. Light represented knowledge, purity, the divine presence. The Church's elaborate theology of light found material expression in candles. The Paschal candle lit at Easter symbolized Christ's resurrection, its flames spreading to smaller candles held by the faithful. The candles placed around a coffin at a funeral mass represented prayers ascending, souls illuminated, death's darkness pushed back. A wealthy person's will might include detailed instructions for the number and size of candles to be burned at their funeral, knowing that this display would be read as a statement about their status and piety. The gradual changes in lighting technology that would eventually reduce the chandler's importance lay centuries in the future. In the medieval period, candles represented the height of illumination technology for most purposes. Oil lamps existed but were expensive to operate and required careful maintenance. Torches were smoky and dangerous in enclosed spaces. Rush lights, made by soaking dried rushes in waste fat, provided the cheapest illumination but were dim and required constant attention. For reliable, sustained, relatively clean light, nothing surpassed a well-made candle. Picture the chandler's workshop as full darkness falls on this long day. The fires have been banked, the kettles cleaned and stored, the day's production counted and shelved. The master chandler makes a final tour of the space, checking that all is secure, that no embers remain to pose a fire risk, that the valuable stock is protected from moisture and vermin. He carries a single candle, perhaps one of his own making, its steady flame casting moving shadows on the familiar walls. Tomorrow the rhythm will begin again, more tallow to render, more wicks to prepare, more hours of patient dipping. But tonight there is rest, the satisfaction of a day's honest labour completed, the knowledge that his products will bring light to churches where prayers rise in the darkness, to merchant houses where business is conducted, to scholars' cells where knowledge is preserved and transmitted. The chandler is neither hero nor villain in the grand narrative of medieval history, but he is essential, one of the countless craftsmen whose patient labour made civilization possible. The survival of the medieval world depended on such men and women, on the accumulation of small skills applied with care, on the transformation of raw materials into useful goods, on the patient teaching of the next generation. The chandler's contribution was measured not in dramatic moments, but in the steady provision of a basic necessity. Every lit altar, every document copied after dark, every household meal eaten in the warm glow of candlelight rested on foundations built in workshops like this one, by hands that smelled perpetually of wax and tallow, by minds that knew the precise feel of properly heated beeswax and the exact rhythm of the dipping dance. As we conclude this long day in the medieval chandler's workshop, we see that the craft embodied values the medieval world held dear. Patience, for nothing about this work could be hurried. Precision, for sloppy technique produced inferior candles that reflected badly on the maker. Honesty, for the guilds and the market punished fraud severely. Humility, for this was not glamorous work, but essential service. And faith, for the chandler knew that his products served sacred purposes, that the light he helped create pushed back not just physical darkness, but spiritual shadow. The chandler's world was small in geographic scope, but rich in human connection. He knew his suppliers personally, understood the lives of the butchers who sold him tallow, the beekeepers who provided wax. He knew his customers, their preferences, their financial situations, their special needs. He knew his apprentices and journeymen, their strengths and weaknesses, their futures in the craft. This web of relationships, replicated in every craft and trade, formed the social fabric of the medieval town. In our modern world of instantaneous electric light, of illumination so cheap and abundant we scarcely think about it, the chandler's patient labour seems almost incomprehensible. That men spent entire lifetimes in the gradual accumulation of wax on wicks, that significant capital and complex organisations existed to supply what we now achieve with a switch. This speaks to how different their world was from ours. Yet the human qualities the work required, the skill, the patience, the pride in craft well done, these remain comprehensible and perhaps even admirable. The medieval chandler has left surprisingly few traces in the historical record. Unlike goldsmiths who produced objects that became treasured heirlooms, or masons whose buildings still stand, the chandler's products were consumed, burned away to nothing, leaving no physical evidence of their existence. What remains are the guild records, the account books, the regulations and lawsuits, the occasional references in chronicles and letters. From these fragments we reconstruct a world, a way of life, a set of skills and relationships that sustained medieval society. As our day in the chandler's workshop draws to a close, we can appreciate that this was a life fully lived despite its apparent monotony. The chandler experienced the satisfaction of mastery, the security of essential skill, the respect of community. His hands created light that served both practical and sacred purposes. His teaching ensured that the craft would continue into the next generation. His honest labour earned him a modest but sufficient living. By the standards of the medieval world, this was success, a good life, a meaningful contribution to the common good. The medieval chandler has left surprisingly few traces in the historical record. Unlike goldsmiths who produced objects that became treasured heirlooms, or masons whose buildings still stand, the chandler's products were consumed, burned away to nothing, leaving no physical evidence of their existence. What remains are the guild records, the account books, the regulations and lawsuits, the occasional references in chronicles and letters. From these fragments we reconstruct a world, a way of life, a set of skills and relationships that sustained medieval society. Yet perhaps there is something fitting in this absence, this disappearance. The chandler's work was always meant to be consumed, to serve its purpose and vanish, leaving behind only the light it provided and the moments that light made possible. The values embedded in the chandler's craft speak across the centuries to us. In an age that prizes speed and efficiency above all, there is something almost revolutionary about work that cannot be hurried, that rewards patience and care over frantic productivity. The chandler could not make his candles dry faster through force of will, could not shortcut the process without producing inferior goods. He learned to work within the constraints of his materials, to align his rhythm with the natural pace of melting and cooling, of building layer upon careful layer. This acceptance of natural limitation, this willingness to let the work take the time it required, stands in stark contrast to our modern insistence that everything can and should be accelerated. The workshop itself represented a kind of monastery of craft, a space dedicated to the repetition of essential tasks until they achieved a quality approaching meditation. The chandler and his workers moved through their day, not in pursuit of novelty or innovation, but in faithful repetition of proven methods. Each dip of the wick was like each bead on a rosary, a small act that gained meaning through accumulation and intention. The modern world often dismisses such repetitive labour as soul-crushing monotony, yet those who practiced these crafts frequently found in them a kind of peace, a freedom from the tyranny of constant decision-making, a satisfaction in physical skill exercised to its fullest. Consider too the chandler's relationship with time itself. His product existed to extend the useful day beyond the boundaries set by nature, to push back the darkness that limited human activity. Yet he himself remained bound by older rhythms, beginning work at dawn, ending at dusk, organising his year around the seasonal availability of materials and the predictable peaks of demand. He sold the ability to transcend natural time while living deeply within it himself. This paradox reflects a larger truth about medieval life, that even as people developed technologies to overcome natural limitations, they remained fundamentally embedded in natural cycles in ways we have almost entirely escaped. the transmission of knowledge from master to apprentice, that intimate relationship of teaching and learning that occurred within the workshop's walls, represents a model of education we have largely abandoned. The apprentice learned not from books or lectures, but from observation, imitation, and correction. He absorbed not just techniques but attitudes, not just skills but values. He learned when to speak and when to remain silent, how to manage relationships with suppliers and customers, how to judge character and materials with equal shrewdness. This education was slow, taking 7 years or more, but it was thorough, producing craftsmen who understood their trade in their bones, whose hands knew things their minds could scarcely articulate. The chandler's integration into the web of medieval urban life reminds us that no craftsman worked in isolation. Every candle represented the labour of the shepherd who tended the sheep, the butcher who slaughtered and rendered, the merchant who transported materials, the woodcutter who supplied fuel, the potter or metalsmith who made the vessels, and finally the chandler who brought all these elements together into something useful and beautiful. This interdependence, this reliance on the skills and honesty of others, created both vulnerability and community. When we buy a modern product, we rarely think about the hundreds of people whose labour made it possible. The medieval chandler lived in constant awareness of his dependence on others and their dependence on him. As the last light fades from our medieval workshop and the chandler secures his building for the night, we might reflect on what has been lost and what remains from this world of patient craft. We have gained immeasurably in convenience, in abundance, in the democratization of goods that were once luxuries. Yet something has also slipped away, a certain quality of attention, a satisfaction in work done slowly and well, a sense of being embedded in place and community through the practice of essential skills. The chandler's world was harder than ours in many ways, more precarious, more limited. But it was also richer in certain textures of human experience, in the deep knowledge that comes only through years of focused practice, in the dignity of being truly necessary to one's community. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the patient rhythms of medieval craftsmanship. If you enjoyed our work and are still awake, please check out our other medieval content, where we explore the quiet corners of history that are so often overlooked. And if you have fallen asleep, please relax and enjoy the rain.